Sony revealed the first images of the new PlayStation 5 controller today, along with interesting new features like its haptic feedback, adaptive triggers, and built-in microphone. It's called the DualSense controller, and I think it looks great. Sony calls it a radical departure from its more iterative DualShock controllers that have come before it, but there are a number of interesting questions surrounding the new design and what that means for things like PlayStation VR, voice chat, and overall gameplay on Sony's new console. So in this video, I'll be exploring some of the biggest questions surrounding the PlayStation 5 controller and what they mean for gamers when they get their hands on the console later this year. So first I want to talk about the new light bar on the controller. Now, the previous controller, the DualShock 4, had a light bar on the top of it that was originally designed to be used as a super accurate reference point for motion controls and pointer controls similar to the Wii. This worked with the PlayStation camera that would effectively track the light bar's position pretty accurately and allow you to incorporate fairly accurate motion controls into games, although admittedly it wasn't used too much because Sony didn't include the camera with the PlayStation 4 and therefore developers couldn't rely on gamers having it and couldn't incorporate those features into their games in a very meaningful way. Of course, later on the light bar was used for PlayStation VR, and so anytime you're using the DualShock 4 controller in PlayStation VR, you're using the light bar extensively on the top of the controller. Now on the new controller, you can see that the light bar's changed quite significantly. So Sony said, we changed the position of the light bar that will give the controller an extra pop. On DualShock 4, it sat on the top of the controller. Now it sits at each side of the touchpad, giving it a slightly larger look and feel. Now what's interesting about this is that Sony talks about the light bar purely from an aesthetic standpoint and doesn't infer any actual functionality behind it. Looking at the renders that they've released, you can see that the light bar surrounds the touchpad, which is like a thin slither of light that goes all the way around and then across the top. And if you look at it closely, you can see that the blue illumination of that bar actually only goes around the side of the touch bar. It doesn't extend to the very top of the controller. It's not illuminated. So the big question is, can the top of the light bar be turned on? Is this something that you can toggle on or off on the PlayStation 5's menu system? Because if it cannot, that would infer that perhaps the new controller doesn't feature any kind of light-based tracking system like the DualShock 4. If it can be turned on, I'd be interested to know if the thin slither of light that it will put out will actually be trackable as accurate as the larger light bar that you see on the DualShock 4. At the very least, the renders suggest that Sony has listened to complaints of the previous light bar reflecting in televisions, and now it's reduced or completely alleviated by the fact that the top of the bar doesn't illuminate all the time. So I want to talk about PlayStation VR support. Now, this is kind of an extension from the discussion about the light bar. If that light bar has been reduced in functionality or is simply just an aesthetic touch now, will the PlayStation VR be compatible with the new DualSense controller? Sony has already confirmed with their initial articles with Wired that the current existing PlayStation VR headset will be compatible with the PlayStation 5, but we don't know to what extent, and there's no specific details yet. If the PlayStation 5 controller doesn't feature the same light bar tracking functionality, that could effectively render it incompatible with the current PlayStation VR system, which uses that top light bar extensively, as we said before. So what that may mean is that you will need to use a DualShock 4 controller to play PlayStation VR on your PlayStation 5, which I think is a bit of a hassle. That's something is not ideal. It would have been nice if you could just use your new controller and have the headset. Even worse, that means if you don't already own a PlayStation VR headset and you buy one as a PlayStation 5 owner, you won't have a DualShock 4. You may not necessarily have a DualShock 4 handy to play with it. So it'll be interesting to see how this is handled in the transition to the new machine. I think it's worth noting that it is technically possible to track objects that aren't illuminated. Sony could potentially just have the camera track the controller itself. It's a very specific size and shape and color. But the reason why Sony included a light bar on the first controller in the first place was because that kind of object tracking technology is inaccurate, and when you have a giant light on the top of the controller, it's something that's very clear to the camera and very specific, very easy to track. when you just have a camera following an ordinary object, that can be comparatively quite inaccurate, and I couldn't see Sony going that way with tracking the new controller. So I think either you'll need a DualShock 4, or perhaps they'll even add on a light bar like clip-on on the top. That also seems quite unlikely, but with the recent release of the back button on the DualShock 4 controller, it at least demonstrates that Sony is not dead against the idea of releasing small add-ons for their controllers. Let's talk briefly about the rear of the controller. Now, you can see from the renders that we have, the images that Sony released, they were very careful not to show the back of the controller. Now, that could just be because there's nothing particularly interesting to see back there, but Sony knows how keen gamers are to see the new hardware from every given angle. And even the back of the controller, even if there's nothing back there but a warranty, but a serial number sticker, they know gamers are going to want to see that sort of stuff. So the fact that they didn't show the controller from the rear face seems like a deliberate move. Why is this notable? Now, Sony, don't forget, released the DualShock 4 back button attachment in 2019, and this is odd, really releasing a feature enhancing update for a 7-year-old console that's just on its way out. The PlayStation 5 is out by the end of this year. So it was an odd move by Sony, but one of the immediate reactions was to assume that perhaps Sony is adding functionality to the DualShock 4 controller that will reflect somewhat on its design ethos for the PlayStation 5, and perhaps even help the DualShock 4 controller become compatible with PlayStation 5 games. Including buttons on the back of the controller is also becoming increasingly common now. A lot of aftermarket controllers include that, and of course Microsoft has the Elite controller, which has optional paddles that can be attached or detached on the back of its Elite controller. With Sony's addition of the back button add-on for the DualShock 4, it would have almost seemed like they agreed with that design philosophy of having buttons on the back of the controller, so it'd be a little bit surprising if they didn't include them on the PlayStation 5. I'd be interested to see what the back of the controller looks like and if they have any hidden features in there that they haven't announced yet. Let's talk about the microphone. So the new controller has a built-in microphone, which will be very handy for you to drop in and out of multiplayer games without having to reach for a dedicated headset, plug it all in and get all set up just to say hi or tell them you can't play or whatever it may be. If you're just going to play briefly, you can just use the microphone on the controller. Great feature. Now, you can clearly see in the renders that there is a mute button, and that's interesting because when the Xbox 360 first came out, there was a mute switch on the headset that came with the console, and it was right down by your thumbs. You could mute yourself and unmute yourself right there without having to take your hand off the controller. Later iterations of this moved the microphone mute button up onto a cable that was sort of chest height, and that was a lot less convenient. I didn't like it particularly. Now, my big question is, will this button be functional when you're using another headset, third-party headset, Bluetooth, wireless? Will that mute button be functional for all PlayStation 5 voice comms? I really hope so, because I like that position, and I hope that you'll be able to use that instead of any switches that may exist on your current headset. Another thing to note on the new controller is the two-tone design. Sony has incorporated a white and black design into this controller, and since controllers tend to follow a similar design ethos to the consoles that they come with, this gives us an interesting insight into the box, which of course Sony hasn't shown yet. So it'd be interesting to see if Sony incorporates a similarly bold two-tone design into the console itself, or if it will just be an all-white console like the predominant shell on the new controller. Sony didn't mention anything about it in its text, but if you look at the top of the controller, you can quite clearly see that they've used USB-C. Now, this is fairly standard these days. The USB-C port is widely taking over as the port of choice, and USB micro is being phased out, but it is a vastly more capable port. So at the very least, the fact that USB-C is a significantly higher amperage port, we could see much faster charging on the PlayStation 5 controller, which is handy because if it has battery life that's anything like the previous controller, you'll be charging it every day. Okay, so to wrap up, I just wanted to discuss some of the smaller points about the controller that people might not necessarily be talking about, but they stood out to me, so I thought they'd be worth noting. The face buttons, so sadly it looks like Sony is moving away from the color-coded face buttons, and since Nintendo also went with monochrome face buttons with the Nintendo Switch, it seems like Microsoft are the only ones left who actually appreciate the color coding on the face buttons. Now, it's an aesthetic choice, I get it. The controller has a really clean white look and the buttons match that design ethos. But, you know, It's not just an aesthetic touch, it helps with correlation when thinking about which button to press. For newer gamers, these colors really help, and I especially found that to be the case with Nintendo's buttons when I was a kid and I was playing Super Nintendo. For my American viewers, just know that in the UK and, well, basically the rest of the world, the Super Nintendo has colored buttons, yellow, red, green, and blue, just like the Microsoft buttons. That's kind of where they got it from, let's be honest. So Sony looks like they're abandoning that. The D-pad. So it looks like Sony is stuck with its traditional D-pad, which is fine. We're all used to it. It's a staple of the PlayStation controller these days. But it also looks like they've incorporated the transparent design, which kind of harks back to the PlayStation Portable. And since I'm a big PSP fan, that's good by me. So the analog sticks, looks like Sony has retained the same rubber grip design as its previous controller, albeit with some enhanced grips around the outside. There looks like there's some very visible patterned ridging around the outside that should help with just a little bit more with grip. Let's all hope that it doesn't suffer the same flaw as the PlayStation 4 controller, which saw people quite easily ripping off the rubber grip on the top of the sticks because it was made of too soft a compound. Let's hope that that doesn't affect the new controller. So a final word on the battery then. The controller looks visibly bulkier. You can see that quite clearly from the side view of the controller on the official post. From what Sony describes, that owes largely to the fact that they have new hardware in there to accommodate the adaptive triggers in the controller, one of the major new features. But a bulkier controller could also mean that they have the room for a larger, higher capacity battery, and that should hopefully help with some of the issues people were having with the DualShock 4 controller running out on an almost daily basis. That controller lasts, I think, 8 to 10 hours, and if you factor in some degradation over time, it can be even less than that. So hopefully the new controller, with the inclusion of all these new features, will manage to put out better battery life than the previous machine. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. This is a new setup for me. I'm still experimenting, I'm still learning, so any feedback you can give, I greatly appreciate it. And if you're gonna complain about something, be nice. All right guys, see you in the next one.